Mr. Messy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Messy was the messiest person you've ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was a messy in everything he did. You could always tell Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he been. Oh yes, Mr. Messy is a messy by name and messy by nature. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy looking house. The paint is peeling, the windows are broken, there were tiles missing from the roof. The flower beds were overgrown with weeds. The garden gate were off its hinges, and because Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately, he had not. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed. Yawned, scratched, got up, cleaned his teeth, leaving the top of the toothpaste, had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes over the floor, and then set off for a walk, tripping over a brush he'd felt lying in the garden 2 weeks before. Ah! I think he just fell. There was a wood behind Mr. Messy's messy house with the messy garden. And that's where he went for his walk. It was particularly large wood, lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it. But he didn't mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked and walked like through the roots until he came to the other side. And do you know what he found on the other side of the wood? Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest looking little cottage that he had ever seen. In a lovely little garden with a stream running through the middle of it. There was a man in the garden clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Good morning, I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I could see that," replied the man, looking him up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy." "And I'm Mr. Neat," said another man, appearing in one of the houses. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. "We're in business together," exclaimed Mr. Tidy. And the people who own this house asked us to do some work for them. "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy things up," added Mr. Tidy. "Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who's looking even messier than usual that particular morning. "But I don't want things neat and tidy," said Mr. Messy, looking down and miserable at the thought of it. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. "But," said Mr. Messy. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. "Off we go," said Mr. Tidy. "But," said Mr. Messy. "But nothing," said Mr. Neat, and bundling him into their van, which is part behind the house. Off they went to Mr. Messy's house on the other side of the wood. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. "Good gracious," added Mr. Tidy. "This is the messiest house I've ever seen in all my born days," they both said together at the same time. "Better do something about it," said Mr. Neat. And before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed and mowed and pruned and snipped and clipped and cleared and dug and made the garden look neater than it had ever looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned and primed and grubbed and painted and netted and made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look like tidier than it did before. Then they both went into the house. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. "Good gracious," said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. And off they set and cleaned the houses from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and quacked and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it looked it ever looked before. "There we are," said Mr. Tidy. All finished, said Mr. Neat. Tidy and neat, said Mr. Tidy. Neat and tidy, said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy didn't know what to say. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. Precisely, said Mr. Tidy. What we're both thinking, they said together to Mr. Messy, is that you look too much messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this. But, said Mr. Messy, and whatever Mr. Messy said, there was no use. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the house, and how, of course, it was neat as a new pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put it straight in the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed and brushed and cleaned and scrubbed and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. He looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror. Do you know what I'm going to have to do now? He said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. What are you going to have to do? They asked Mr. Messy. I think I'm going to have to change my name, said Mr. Messy. Then he chuckled. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled. And Mr. Messy laughed. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed. And they all laughed together and became the best of friends. And that really is the end of the story. Except to say that if you were a messy person, you might have to have a visit from two people. And you know what they are called, don't you? No! Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy. Technically. No boy, that's Butterpoop's cat. Why is Mr. Messy the opposite of messy? They cleaned him up. When I pulled up a Mr. Med episode called Library, I would have said that he is clean. Like, when he's clean, and then Miss Naughty just combed and scrubbed him. That's a little weird. And Lucy. I think it's some egads. I'd like a piece of meat. Shazam! This is messy as usual. And technically, this is a mess. You fuck.